of the crack, producing huge volumes of sediments that settle out of this muddy water all over the earth. These sediments trapped and buried plants and animals, forming the fossil record. This erosion widened the rupture. Eventually, the width was so great that the compressed rock beneath the subterranean chamber sprung upward, giving birth to the mid-oceanic ridge that wraps around the earth like the seam of a baseball. The continental plates, the hydroplates, still with lubricating water beneath them, slid downhill away from the rising mid-Atlantic ridge. After the massive, slowly accelerating continental plates reached speeds of about 45 miles per hour, they ran into resistances, compressed, and buckled. The portions of the hydroplate that buckled down formed ocean trenches. Those that buckled upward formed mountains. This is why the major mountain chains are parallel to the oceanic ridges from which they slid. The hydroplates, in sliding away from the oceanic ridges, opened up very deep ocean basins into which the floodwaters retreated. On the continents, each bowl-shaped depression or basin was naturally left brimful of water, producing many post-flood lakes.
The demonstrations you have just witnessed of a massive worldwide catastrophe in antiquity supports the biblical story of the deluge in every detail.
All right, that's Walt Brown's hydroplate theory, which I think is excellent. A couple key things he talks about in there is that the canyons had to form quickly as lakes overflowed their boundary. But the other thing is about the mid-Atlantic ridge. What would cause that? This picture here shows that if a spring is compressed and you have two bricks on top of it, as the bricks slide apart, all of a sudden the spring's going to pop up in the center. Apparently the earth was originally created with a layer of dirt for Adam and Eve to grow their stuff in, and then granite. Granite is amazing rock. There's a place right behind the church here that sells, big slabs of beautiful granite for countertops and stuff, and I got these samples from him. This one's from Brazil. Granite apparently was the original basement rock, and it was not formed by melting rock cooling down. Well, Halos.com, Robert Gentry has an excellent book called Creation's Tiny Mystery, which proves granite was never a hot molten mass. It was created instantly, like the Bible says, under water. We covered that in video 7. Under the granite was apparently a layer of water where the subterranean water chambers were, and then a layer of basalt, which is a different kind of rock. The basalt underneath would spring up into the crack as the mid-Atlantic ridge got wider. As these ridges widened, as Walt Brown says, it's going to spring up. The basalt will bounce up in the center, and the plates will slide away. So there was movement of the plates, but that's not proof for Pangea. Now what happened, as the basalt springs up, it's going to crack, and water's going to fill in the cracks. Now today, they're not only full of water, they're full of sediments. It's been 400 years since the flood. The cracks are gone. They're all full of dirt. But when they measured the magnetic intensity, what they were actually finding were the cracks where the water rushed in. Because as basalt cools down, it stores a stronger magnetic field. If the basalt is hot, it doesn't store a magnetic field. You can put a magnet in your oven, heat it up, it'll lose its magnetic strength. So it's simply finding the cracks where the earth busted up into plates. That's all they're finding. Get the book if you want. Well, he's got a whole section on that in his book here in the beginning. Hot basalt loses its magnetism, and cold basalt stores a strong magnetic field. So that's what they were finding at the bottom of the mid-Atlantic ridge. There are no places where a north-seeking compass points south. Now, it is true there is still a little bit of subduction today, as in, plates of the earth are being drawn under. If you ever cook pudding or something, and it develops a skin on it, sometimes the skin on the pudding all of a sudden will just sink to the bottom. And if you push it down in one place, it'll draw more down with it, okay? I think some of that is happening, or has happened, with the crust of the earth. Sections have slid down under. Hawaii, for instance, is over a hot spot, and it appears to be moving. I think there is plate subduction right there. But I don't think it's been going on for millions of years. The other factor that really is confusing for evolutionists is, when you look at the bottom of the ocean, there's not much sediment down there. All the dirt washes into the oceans. You'd think the oceans would fill up with dirt. But when they check it out, there's only a few thousand years worth of dirt down there. So why don't the oceans have huge layers of really, really deep sediment? Well, one theory is they're not millions of years old. The other theory is, well, it's being recycled, it's being pulled under. That's why this plate movement theory is so important to the evolutionist. They have actually several serious problems they're trying to overcome. We'll cover in a minute. It's true there seems to be a little bit of plate subduction sliding under other plates. I agree. It's true the earth is busted up. We have fault lines. I agree. That doesn't prove it's been going for millions of years. The plates are moving, but it doesn't prove time, okay? And it doesn't prove the rate we see today has always been the same. I think Walt Brown's hydroplate theory is excellent. As the water's escaping from underneath, it's going to provide lubrication to slide these things faster. Today, there's very little water left down there. And students, I think, ought to be taught there are other options to this one silly theory. We live right here in Pensacola, Florida. My place is 2.6 miles south of Interstate 10 off Highway 29. If I go up to the interstate and stand there and I watch somebody headed east toward Jacksonville, does that prove he started in Los Angeles 4 days ago? No, they might have just got on at the next exit down there, right? The fact that we see the plates moving does not prove anything as far as time. Here's the flaw in their logic. They look at the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean spreading about 3 centimeters a year, about an inch, a little over an inch a year it is spreading. And they'll say, see, look at the distance across there. It's so many thousand miles and 1 inch a year. That proves, you know, blah, 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 millions of years. That proves you're making some assumptions in your calculations. That's all that proves, okay? Plus they're forgetting the continental shelf, and forgetting the shapes of the continents is just a pure coincidence. If you raise the water 600 feet, you know, from here to the highway, Chicago is underwater. The oceans average 12,000 feet deep. Just a 600-foot change would put Chicago underwater. We'll show more on that in the second session here. Continental drift theory in the textbooks is trying to avoid 2 embarrassing problems. Number 1, the magnetic field's getting weaker, saying the Earth is young, and there's not much dirt in the bottom of the ocean, saying the Earth is young. Those are 2 evidences of a young Earth that they're trying desperately to avoid with their continental drift theory. Okay, so what about the Ice Age? Is it true that the Earth was covered with ice? Well, maybe not the whole Earth, but there was ice all the way down to Kansas City, Missouri. I was just up in, I've just been everywhere. I was in British Columbia day before yesterday. Someplace where they have these large terminal moraines and drumlins, big, huge piles of rocks. You know, as I studied this for years in earth science, it's fascinating to see ice, when it melts back, leaves behind a pile of rocks. When I was in Washington climbing Mount Rainier, my sister lives out there, they had a picture of this huge pile of rocks and somebody standing on top of it in front of this big glacier. They're going to get their picture taken. You know, the man's up there standing on this massive pile of big boulders, you know, and he's smiling, not realizing, you know why that pile of boulders is there? They're coming off the top of that glacier. So his wife takes the picture just as one about the size of a basketball falls down just behind his head from about 130 feet up. If that would hit him on the head, he'd have to open his shirt to eat the rest of his life, man. Glaciers leave behind piles of rocks when they melt back. If it's on the side, it's called a lateral moraine. If it's in front, it's called a terminal moraine. But there's no question there is obvious evidence the Earth had an ice age. All over Ohio and Indiana, from a famous drumlin where ice carved around a hill is Bunker's Hill or Breed's Hill, where the Revolutionary War started. That's formed by ice. There's no question there was an ice age, but the question is, where does it fit into the Bible? And was it really millions of years ago? As these glaciers plow ahead, they leave behind all these rocks, and they melt back, and the rocks stay there. And all over places in Illinois and Ohio, you see these piles. If you dig down in, you hit big boulders. And they're usually rounded, smooth boulders. So what caused the Ice Age? We're going to cover that in the Hovind theory. And what froze the mammoths? Those big, hairy, hippie elephants that are found frozen, standing up sometimes, food still in their mouth. The Beresovka mammoth, found in 1901, was a famous one. Part of the trunk and front foot had been eaten by wolves, apparently, but the rest of it was still frozen in the ground. They dug it out, it's in a museum in Russia. How do you freeze an elephant standing up? And it's not just one, I mean many thousands. In 1 year, they removed 20,000 pairs of tusks. 1 year. It's called fossil ivory. This is one right here, a small one from a baby one. I've got a friend in Alaska that goes over to Siberia, and he buys and trades in fossil ivory. He carves things out of it. Amazing, beautiful little carvings out of, you know, ancient ivory that was frozen. Well, how do you freeze an elephant? It's not just one. Walt Brown's got a page in his book here about the map showing where all the different frozen mammoth and frozen rhinoceros are found, frozen camels near the North Pole, frozen bobcat. What happened? How do you explain this from a biblical worldview? Well, some of the mammoths are frozen standing up, not all of them. So they have undigested food still in their stomach and still in their teeth. They didn't even swallow their last bite. They died of suffocation. There's no water found in the lungs. And the small ice crystals in the blood indicate they probably froze in less than 5 hours. How do you freeze an elephant in less than 5 hours? I got curious about this, so I called Birds Eye Frozen Food people in New York. I called physics professors, I called meat packers, I called everybody I could think of, butchers that might have an answer. And I said, how on earth would you freeze an elephant? I said, when I called Bird's Eyes, talked to one of the scientists there, I said, if I stuck an elephant in the freezer, what would happen? It was silence on the other end of the line. He said, you'd have a crowded freezer. I said, well, yeah, I know that, but I said, how long would it take to freeze an elephant? He said, well, normal freezers are about, 10 below, maybe 10 above, 0. Probably take about 5 hours to freeze an elephant.